Good morning and welcome to the new episode of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Call. The economy of the world, being global, has been shifting its base. At one time, it was Europe, which was a center of attraction and the economic leader. Then came USA, and it did a pretty long time. But recently, people have been thinking the Chinese economy is going to be the predominant one, and it was said that this century is going to be the Chinese century. Not any longer. IMF said that India's economy is likely to be improving by 12 to 13%, while Chinese would go up by 6%. China has a major issue of population, which India doesn't have, as we discussed last time. Nevertheless, whether this century is going to be India's century or not would depend on diverse factors. Nothing is written in stone as far as the economic leadership or the political leadership is concerned. But the forecast of the double-digit growth, the capability of the Indian entrepreneurs, and at the same time, a dedicated leadership and assertion of the national forces has some hope that this century would be India's century. But what recently happened when Narendra Modi stunned the nation on November 19th when he removed the three farm laws, people were disillusioned, at least the investors were disillusioned, the economists were disillusioned. Imagine a government at the zenith of power, with a brutal majority in the parliament, succumbed to the protest. Well, this was a great victory for India's democracy. And although farmers think that they won, it was a defeat for the farmers, especially for the small-scale farmers, because it crushed their hopes of freedom from trade cartels, state functionaries, and a peasant's life. So how does one reconcile a victory for democracy with defeat of economy? And what does this mean for the future of reforms? And also the possibility that India's century is in thing. The present government's economic infrastructure policies have been transformational that nobody can deny. And it is precisely the relentless race of reforms that induced India's economic revival to achieve a GDP growth of upward of 8.3% recently, and for the next year going to be 12%. But what does the U-turn of the formula portend for the pace of reforms in the pipeline? For the performance of 7.5 years of Modi-led NDA regime would be history. And would history judge Modi as a status quoist for having come to repealing the contentious farm laws, or an incrementalist as the reformer? Now that's most important. If he is incrementalist as the reformer, then okay, one step backward doesn't mean much. In the history of the nations, one withdrawal is not a catastrophe. It is precisely the relentless pace of reforms that had induced India's economic revival to achieve a GDP growth. Political sagacity dictates that even progressive reforms, if perceived to be against the will of the majority of the stakeholders, are put in the cold storage. Just as the land acquisition ordinance was allowed to lapse by the Modi government itself in 2015, people have forgotten that. An ordinance was issued for land acquisition. There was opposition. It was a very good ordinance, well thought of. But since there was opposition, government quietly did not allow it to become a law, and it lapsed. Bihar polls were the main cause of that lapsing. Conversely, before introducing major reforms, marketing and effective communication skills are needed. Unfortunately, that marketing has not been done as far as the farm laws are concerned. Communication was defective. The Indian agriculture sector constitutes the largest vote bank in the country, and it's exempt from paying income tax. A strong and affluent section of the farming committee has held to ransom the rest of the farming committee who have holding of less than 1 hectare. And this fact should have been drummed to the farmers, which it was not. It was this affluent lobby that acted as saboteurs of the larger interest of the poorer farmers. The opponents of Modi government see the repeal of the 3 laws as a mid-course reversal of economic reforms process. The same way they felt the inability to pass the land reforms in 2015. But 2015, though the ordinance lapsed, the pace of the reforms did not change. And then it's for us to see that despite the lack of political consensus on progressive policies like land and agriculture reforms, the momentum of the government's reform agenda has slackened to some extent. But with the structural and social sector reforms implemented before 2020 and thereafter during the pandemic, this has been a period of watershed reforms that nobody can deny. And it looks like that the reforms will continue to scale up till the elections of 2014. And let me tell you, these reforms are going to be as transformational as those of Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh team were in 1991. That nobody can deny. They were transformational. And so are Modi's reforms going to be. Just a few of the path-breaking financial sector reforms that have been enacted in the last 7.5 years are: first was cleaning up of the flawed banking system and the mounting non-performance assets, NPAs. Law was enacted, insolvency and bankruptcy court. People are not aware, but it was a landmark in the history of the banking management. The Indian banking companies were shattered before this code came into being, and this IBC was enacted in 2016. And do you know it has helped recover $2.5 trillion, rupees from the corporate defaulters. And we want the country to have a 5 trillion economy in the next 4 years. So if we want 5 trillion and 2.5 trillion we have already recovered from the corporate defaulters, isn't that a major achievement? And imagine the recovery rate is 36% as of June this year. Earlier it used to be 5%, 6%. And it jumped with this IBC code, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, passed in 2016. From 5% it jumped to 36%. The government subsequently recapitalized banks and empowered the debt recovery tribunals. A dedicated stressed asset management vertical was formed. Now these actions have been taken and they have been implemented. And as I said, 2.5 trillion rupees is not something to be sneezed at. This action alone makes India stand in the front line of the economically powerful countries. Post-COVID, the center began the process of unlocking infrastructure assets through asset monetization program. And that will also release substantial revenues. There's a scheme, again people may not be aware of, the productivity linked incentive scheme. It has an outlay of 20,000 crores and it was laid out to boost 14 sectors. Are you aware that recently work was started on the Asia's biggest airport in UP, Noida Airport? And after Air India's privatization in the pipeline is a sale of BPCL and BEML. And by March, these two corporates are likely to be privatized. Then there will be mega LIC initial public offering early next year. Not fully privatization, but say 49% might be released to public, so 51% remains with the government. But look at the input. India's national infrastructure pipeline. Do you know how much the outcome is going to be? $1.5 trillion. It's more ambitious than what is being undertaken in USA. Opposition doesn't talk about it. The government has done the action, but as I said, the communication is not there. So 2.5 trillion rupees and $1.5 trillion. And yet, people think that the country is suffering. Then, 111 lakh crores 5-year plan, that is from 2020 to 2025. This was financing infrastructure investment. That is 111 lakh crores of rupees to be spent in 5 years in infrastructure. And that necessitates a reimagined approach and tapping alternate financing through innovative ways. An estimate of 17% of the aggregate outlays proposed to be met through mechanisms such as asset recycling and monetization. The new long-term initiatives such as development finance institutions and the government's commitment to scale up infrastructure investments to fiscal pressures. And let's not forget that the government for the first time is giving extra attention to the infrastructure development, which is vital for overall economic growth and recovery due to backward linkages. And those backward linkages shall provide momentum to core sector demand. And not only that, it holds a promise of highest potential for employment elasticity. There are two other distinct emerging verticals of growth, which people don't talk about it or they are not aware of it. The exponential growth of the digital economy and it's greening the economy that will propel India to be the outstanding economic powerhouse. And that's why I say this century is not going to be Chinese century, it's going to be India's century. And with the pandemic being contained to an endemic, business sentiment continues to surge with the resumption of demand. Corporate resumes capital expenditure, and sectors like IT, pharma, steel, cement, real estate and infrastructure are taking the lead in investment. And the level of investment that's coming up is something humongous. Simultaneously, another thing is happening. The finance minister has been pushing the government and the public sector companies to buy more. They are not asked to not to buy. They are not being asked to save more, but to buy more. And when they buy more, it shall provide a kickstart to the economy, because a virtuous cycle of supply and demand shall be created. And there's a sense of cautious optimism in industry. And that's why Tata could come up to take over Air India. And that's why Zurich Airport agreed to take up, as a part of PPP, the Noida Airport. And this has been fueled by, again, a very sensible decision, the low interest rates. And the monetary policy is very accommodative now. The government reduced corporate tax rates, and the purpose is to eliminate burdensome compliances and reduce the need of licensing and multiple approvals. Even today, 75 approvals are required. They are down from a couple of hundred, but they need to be only 3 or 4. And then there is a hastening of the resolution of the commercial disputes, because now the disputes are to be resolved by mediation and not by litigation. Then, the new concepts are coming which are purely Indian. Gati Shakti is being done. And if you look at the pace of the Gati Shakti, that is the speed and the force of reforms that have propelled economic growth upturn this year, that Gati Shakti is something humongous. And it looks to me that the Modi government will leave no stone unturned for the next 2 years. So that by the end of the second inning, that is 2024, he is perceived as the tallest reformer of the post-independent India. What Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh team did was great. Nobody can deny it. For the first time, we opened up. But what Modi has done is many times more than what Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh team could even dream of. And this speed and force, which is multifaceted, is providing a bulwark of support parameters to the economy. There's another benefit, trait of this government. It retains the political mandate. Even the opposition knows that there is no alternative. And when there is no alternative, and the political will is there to persist with the tough reforms, one withdrawal might look to be a reversal, but it is not. It's just one section, one aspect. And then the fact that he holds the highest global approval rating of 70% in a post-COVID time gives him a global acceptability, and the foreign investors know that since he is going to be there for a long time, at least for the next dozen years. He has his party. They can invest easily. And 70% approval rate after 7.5 years of being in job is something which is tremendous. And that is providing the momentum for the India's century. So these multifarious reforms, if carried through, and the likelihood and the probability is that they'll be carried through, is going to be instrumental in A, removing the inertia, and B, providing the momentum for the industry, for the regulatory authorities, for the banking sector, financing sector, to join hands and make the 21st century as not the Asian century, not the Chinese century, but the Indian century. And blessed are the people of that country who will live in this shining era. Thank you.